There is something grotesque in a woman who survives too long, when all the others are buried beheaded, banished, broken, and she alone remains, not victorious, not beloved, simply still breathing, a flickering candle in a room that has already burned. She had kissed the lips that had condemned queens, had shared a bed still warm from death. She had stroked the hand that signed execution warrants with the same ease as it lifted a goblet. And when the hand grew cold and the crown too heavy, she dared to outlive him. Not just as widow, but as witness. Catherine Parr did not die on the scaffold. She died in a nursery, but her death was no less cruel. For what is cruelty, if not silence when you scream, if not blood where there should be milk, if not betrayal that wears the face of tenderness? Her final breath was not dragged from her by a blade, but by a fever that curled beneath her skin like a serpent, slow, smoldering, unseen. Her womb became her tomb. Her cries echoed in the same stone halls where once she taught the gospel, where once she wrote of faith and submission. And yet, when her end came, no scripture saved her. No prayer softened the sheets. No heads rolled. Only her own mind did. Down, down into the pit of childbed delirium where the child lives and the mother does not. She had walked through fire and married it. And though she left the pyre behind, the ashes followed. She had ruled a kingdom without a crown. She had lectured a tyrant king. She had made herself indispensable and thus disposable. Catherine Parr, the wife who watched the blood of others dry and thought she had been spared. But mercy is never gentle in palaces built on bones. She died with her eyes open. Catherine Parr was not born for thrones, but she learned how to walk their corridors without sound, how to kneel without breaking, how to speak without trembling, and how to stay alive in a court that swallowed women whole. Her name was not carved into destiny like the others who danced before the axe, but fate found her regardless, lured her with whispers, and seated her beside a man whose kiss carried the rot of 6 queens and whose crown was forged in the heat of vanities and executions. She arrived not as a lover, but as a scholar, not as a girl, but as a widow twice worn, bearing the scent of other men's beds and the memory of their funerals still folded in her garments. Her hands were soft but ink-stained, her eyes sharp but weary, and her tongue more dangerous than any sword that had ever brushed the king's throat. She read him scripture while the ghosts of Anne and Catherine and Jane paced behind the tapestries, and he, with hands trembling from disease and pride, let her guide his thoughts, though never his power. He was a lion in decay, and she, a lamb that had learned to wear wolf's fur. In the golden halls of Hampton, she whispered lessons not of lust but of salvation, and it made the courtiers uneasy how this final wife did not flatter, did not weep, did not beg to be seen. She taught children to reason, men to reflect, and the king himself to listen, though his ears had long been deaf to everything but the echo of his own voice. Yet the palace walls were not made for clarity. They were built of secrets and mirrors and bloodstains too old to scrub clean. Each step she took was on someone else's grave, and the marble remembered. Beneath the laughter of banquets and the rustle of velvet, the air was always too still. She knew that even in daylight, the Tudor court walked in shadows, that every smile was an offering, every glance a judgment, every silence a blade. She had seen Jane die with a son in her womb, Anne die with a prayer on her tongue, Catherine die forgotten in exile, and she knew better than to ask for loyalty from a king who could kiss and kill in the same breath. But she also knew how to endure, and so she wrapped herself in intellect, clothed herself in virtue, and stepped carefully between the teeth of men who had sharpened them on their own wives. Her chambers were lined not just with books, but with eyes watching, weighing, waiting. Every day she outlived was a defiance. Every lesson she taught was a provocation. The court, accustomed to queens who curtsied or cried, did not know what to make of one who argued, who published, who believed she could outthink what she could never outrun. She was no fool, and yet she hoped. She believed that words might be gentler than swords, that faith might be stronger than lust, that she, perhaps, might rewrite the end of a story already written in blood. But the ink in this court was poison, and the pages always turned themselves. Henry watched her with a gaze grown dim from gout and paranoia. His heart, a rotted empire, she dared to enter with a lantern. She had nursed him through illnesses that left him howling in the night, had pressed cold cloths to his burning brow, and still, when she spoke of reform, when she reached toward grace, there were whispers that she was a heretic in a queen's dress. He could not kill her, not while she held his heir's affection, not while she soothed his pain, but he could prepare the soil. He could watch her falter, and he did. Her enemies waited behind confessionals and curtains, their rosaries clinking like chains, their smiles stained with the wine of communion and contempt. They watched her teach, and they called it defiance. They watched her write, and they called it rebellion. In truth, they feared her, because she did not ask for their permission. She did not need to bare her body to hold power. She used her mind, and it was unclean in their eyes. A woman should be obedient, but she was not. A queen should be silent, but she was not. A widow should be grateful, but she dared to be ambitious. She spoke of scripture as if it belonged to her, and the men who thought themselves gatekeepers of heaven began to murmur of fire. But fire would not come yet, only the cold. After Henry died, bloated and blackened, rotting before his breath had fully left him, she walked through the silence like a shadow uncloaked. She had worn widowhood before it fit like a second skin, but this time it came with a child inside her and a man beside her who had once knelt for the king's forgiveness. Thomas Seymour, brother to a regent, lover to ambition, a man whose charm ran faster than his sense. He courted her before the king's body had cooled, and when they wed in secrecy, it was not love that danced in the darkened chapel, but a hunger to carve a new crown from old flesh. She thought she had chosen freedom. Instead, she had chosen her executioner. But that would come later, quietly, in the hush of candlelight and blood. For now, she smiled in painted gardens and pressed her belly with a trembling hand. And around her, the world smiled back with teeth hidden behind lace. In the cradle of Sudeley Castle, far from the palace but not far enough from its curses, she prepared to give birth not just to a daughter, but to a future that would never remember her face. Her name had been spoken beside kings, her hand held in parliaments, her breath exhaled into laws. But in these final months, she was only flesh, heavy, weary, bending toward the same grave that had swallowed her sisters. Her body, once spared by the axe, now prepared to betray her from within. And outside her chamber, courtiers watched the wind, wondering if the queen would live long enough to see the child she carried, or whether the earth would take both in one breathless gasp. The kingdom did not pray for her. It had already moved on. Elizabeth had returned to her own shadows. The new king played with puppets carved by regents, and the court, always hungry, turned its eyes to fresher meat. But she, Catherine Parr, the final wife, the last queen of a monster grown old, lingered in a quiet room where roses died too soon and air hung thick with the smell of waiting. Her strength was not in defiance now, but in stillness. She had no need to speak anymore. Her whole body had become a story, a slow one, a painful one, and no one was listening. Not anymore. In the dim corridors of Sudeley Castle, where the tapestries did not hide murder but muffled its echoes, the air thickened with secrets, and Catherine Parr lay not yet dying, but already betrayed. Betrayal does not always arrive as a blade or a sentence. It can wear a lover's smile, speak in nursery rhymes, or slip into the room with the hush of midwives, while her belly swelled with the weight of a life she had longed to cradle. The man she had chosen, the man who had burned for her, even before the king's breath had stilled, paced the halls with impatience, desire curdling into disdain. Thomas Seymour had wrapped himself in ambition like a shroud, and now that the queen was quieted by childbed, he saw her not as sovereign but as obstacle. He spoke of her with reverence by day and resentment by night, whispering to servants, to secretaries, to shadows lamenting his poor fortune, hinting at promises denied, boasting of futures yet stolen. And around him gathered the hungry, those who had hovered at Henry's court like flies circling a decaying gourd. Now turned toward New Carrion. They whispered too, their voices slithering beneath the tapestries like damp wind, their prayers soaked in envy, their loyalties as thin as the gold threads lining their cuffs. They had not forgotten the fire in Catherine's voice when she argued doctrine, when she edited the words of holy men, when she published thoughts under her own name. They had not forgiven her for surviving where others had perished. Now, they wondered aloud, could a woman who wielded scripture be trusted with a child? Could a widow so hasty to remarry be permitted peace? Could a queen, now no longer queen, still pose a threat to those who wore the king's blood like armor? Thomas knew these doubts, and he fed them, not overtly, not with poison or knife, but with inaction, with absence, with a silence that sharpened like a blade. He did not sit beside her during the worst of the pain. He did not shield her from the rumors that trickled through the cracks. He smiled at her as one might smile at a portrait already darkening with age. Even Elizabeth, the girl whose mind Catherine had once shaped like a careful potter, grew wary under Seymour's presence. He was too eager, too intimate, brushing past doors not meant to open, whispering in ways that bent innocence toward discomfort. The house trembled not with joy for the expected child, but with confusion, with coldness, with a sense that something holy had been turned inside out. When Catherine moaned in her sleep, when her mind began to wander from the fever creeping beneath her skin, no one read her words aloud anymore. No one brought her books or music or prayers. The midwives entered, and they bowed, but their hands trembled. Not from reverence, from dread. Blood came earlier than expected. A river without sound, without warning. Her screams were not royal. They tore through the halls like the cries of a woman being flayed, and yet no one answered them with urgency. The birth was long and cruel. Her body, noble yet fallible, shook with the final indignities of womanhood, a queen reduced to trembling flesh. Soaked sheets, and the smell of something ancient and violent. The child came, but joy did not follow. A daughter, pale and silent, cradled by hands that already seemed to prepare for mourning. Catherine bled still, not quickly, not gloriously, but in pulses, as if her soul had grown hesitant, uncertain whether to stay or flee. Her mind began to fracture. She spoke to those who had long been dead. She called for Henry. She called for Jane. She called for a forgiveness no one knew how to offer. Thomas stood at the edge of her bed, distant, eyes clouded not with grief but calculation. He held the infant once, and then passed her to a nurse as one would pass a ledger, a contract, a relic. His ambitions had shifted. He would not rule through Catherine. He would not be remembered through her memory. So he began writing other letters. He lobbied for guardianship of the young king. He plotted paths toward power that no longer needed the queen's hand. He had traded love for opportunity, and now, with her body weakening, he saw freedom disguised as loss. Outside, the castle walls stood quiet, but within them, death paced with bare feet and closed eyes, unseen, but not unfelt. Servants moved like phantoms. Candles burned too low. No one sang, no one wept. The corridors held their breath. Catherine, once so composed, now wept without reason, laughed without sound, whispered names that had never belonged to anyone living. The fever had curled into her bones like ivy, and her soul had begun to rot while her body still clung to breath. She accused the nurses of theft, of betrayal, of witchcraft. She accused Thomas, and he said nothing. He did not soothe. He did not stay. He disappeared when she needed him, and returned only when the silence grew too loud. Her cries became background noise, her madness an inconvenience, and so she was left alone, dying not as queen, but as burden. The woman who had once corrected kings now babbled nonsense in a room that smelled of iron and wet linen. The woman who had once shaped theology now mistook the ceiling for heaven and begged it to forgive her. And outside, England did not pause. The court moved forward, already chasing other scandals, other deaths. Thomas, restless and bitter, had already begun his descent into his own ruin, though he did not yet know it. He thought himself rid of her. He thought he had survived her death. But death does not part lovers, it binds them in different ways. His betrayal would outlive him, his name dragged down with hers in the margins of history, forgotten by the living, but not by the stones. Catherine's body cooled slowly. The blood ceased, the breath faded. No executions, no fanfare, just a stillness so profound it could only belong to a woman the world had chosen to ignore as it destroyed her. The midwives folded her hands. The child cried only once. The window stayed shut. The world outside Sudeley never heard the final scream, never smelled the rot, never touched the sweat. And Thomas, who once vowed to serve her even unto death, did not attend the burial. But the betrayal did not end with the breath. It coiled around her memory like ivy around a tomb, persistent, choking, silent. After her death, the air inside the castle shifted not from mourning, but from the quiet removal of consequence. Her body, still warm, was hurriedly prepared, wrapped in sheets that had once absorbed her agony, and lowered into the earth not with reverence but with relief. Her name, once embroidered into royal silk and spoken alongside kings, was now spoken in hushed tones only by the wind curling through the crypt stones. Thomas Seymour did not linger. He fled Sudeley with the haste of a man escaping a scene he had written but refused to perform. He left behind the child, left behind the staff, left behind the blood-stained bed where a queen had died without court, without witness, without prayer, in London. He rewrote himself, husband of a dead queen, uncle to a living king, aspirant to power, cloaked in mourning garb. He smiled at those who asked about the child and said she was fine. He attended banquets, gave gifts, whispered schemes behind draperies laced with candle soot. But death, patient as frost, walked a step behind him, waiting for his neck to lower. Catherine had died alone, but he would not. He would die with steel at his throat and curses at his back, caught in a noose he had knotted with his own ambition. And even then, as he knelt to meet the block, the world barely remembered the woman he had left bleeding in the quiet bed of Sudeley. Her ghost did not scream it watched. Her final days were not marked by ceremony, only silence. There were no courtiers whispering blessings behind their fans, no clergy offering Latin rites, no daughters weeping beside the bed of a once queen. There was only the smell of sweat steeped in old fabric, the bitter tang of dried herbs crushed underfoot, and the distant ticking of a time that no longer counted for her. The walls of Sudeley Castle, once lined with the laughter of summer feasts, now sagged with a stillness so absolute it seemed to seep into the stone. Catherine lay beneath a canopy that had once signified royal dignity, but which now hung limp like a forgotten flag, its threads unraveling slowly as though mourning ahead of the body it shadowed. She had once been called wise, beloved, pious, but as the fever fractured her mind and blurred the days into a single, crawling breath, none of those words remained. What lived now was only a tangle of hallucinations and half-spoken names. The dead returning in fragments, the living receding into shadows. She saw Henry in the corners of her vision, not the bloated beast who had married her, but the young king of paintings, smiling with crimson lips and empty eyes. She saw Jane Seymour, arms outstretched in a white gown soaked to the elbows in blood, whispering lullabies to a child that never breathed. She saw Anne Boleyn, mouth open in a silent scream, her head still somehow intact, nodding as though in grim approval. They came not to welcome her, but to wait. Women who had shared her bed, her crown, her doom. She spoke to them. She asked them what waited beyond, and they said nothing. She had fled the axe, but the judgment came anyway, not swift, not merciful, but slow and private, like a candle guttering in a sealed room. Outside, no bells tolled. The court, drunk on its own youth, on the soft laughter of boy kings and the fresh flesh of new queens, did not remember her face. Elizabeth, her stepdaughter and former student, wrote no letters. Edward, too young and too distracted, offered no prayers, the child she bore. Mary Seymour was swaddled in silence and set adrift into history like a forgotten raft, no legacy, no echo. The nurses said the Queen had died of childbed fever, but the truth curled deeper than any infection. Catherine died of accumulation of years spent swallowing her voice, of nights spent beside a king with rotting legs and a god complex, of days crafting careful obedience while her mind itched with fire. She died of watching too many women buried in white veils. She died of being wise, too wise, in a world that rewarded only beauty and silence. She had written books, not just read them. She had dared to argue theology with bishops, to correct the king in his own bedchamber, to believe that a woman could be both devout and thinking, but the world does not forgive such sins easily. After her death, her name was etched in pale stone with no epitaph. No inscription captured the complexity of her mind, the weight of her endurance. Her books, once published under her own name, were quietly forgotten. The printing blocks were melted for more acceptable words. Her letters were boxed, her portraits removed. Even her grave, buried in the chapel at Sudeley, was lost for centuries, hidden beneath the soft feet of those who walked without knowing who they stepped upon. Time did not honor her. It smothered her. And yet, beneath the dust, her ghost stirred, not in vengeance, but in memory. She lingered in the silence of women forced to smile, in the pages of censored books, in the glance of a girl reading scripture alone in her chamber. She had no monument, but she had left herself inside the minds she had once shaped. Elizabeth remembered. She did not weep, but she remembered. She remembered the voice that had corrected her grammar, that had shown her the Latin margins, that had whispered caution where others screamed duty. And perhaps it was that memory, not maternal, but mental, that carved the path of the Queen Elizabeth would one day become, not as mirror, but as answer. Still, Catherine's legacy was not carved in victories. It was carved in the spaces between, in the breath held before a woman speaks, in the shudder of a man whose ambition outran his control, in the ink of a female hand signing a preface. Her death was not horrific in spectacle. It lacked the clang of blade on block, the sobbing crowds, the heads held aloft by trembling arms, but it was horrific in its intimacy, in the way her body betrayed her as all watched and none intervened, in the way a queen was reduced to a womb and then erased when that womb turned septic. She became her own forgotten warning. A woman too learned, too outspoken, too necessary to destroy outright, so she was instead allowed to suffer, and that suffering was sanctified by silence. No one declared her a martyr. though her crime had been faith and her punishment had been madness. No one burned her as a heretic. Though she had challenged orthodoxy with every breath, she had threaded the needle of survival in a court of blades, and in the end, it was not steel that undid her, but blood and heat in the terrible stillness of an uncaring room. In the years that followed, her name was passed between historians like an afterthought. Wife number 6, the one who survived. They spoke of her as fortunate, never seeing the irony that survival, in her case, meant a slower death. They forgot the fever, the blood, the whispers. They forgot the loneliness. They forgot the betrayal. Only the stone remembered, and even it cracked. Her grave lay undisturbed but unvisited, her bones arranged by accident when they were rediscovered centuries later. Her identity verified not by reverence but by matching scraps of silk and the faint imprint of royal embroidery. No relics were kept, no sainthood offered. Her memory, like her final breath, faded into damp earth and cold stone. And yet, the story never ends where it pretends to. In every woman told to stay silent, she stirs. In every page rejected for being too bold, she watches. In every moment, a queen dies in childbirth and is praised for her sacrifice. She whispers. The court had thought her quiet, but they were wrong. The silence had been waiting, and now it speaks in ruins, in echoes, in daughters. Her daughter, Mary Seymour, vanished into history, fostered out, perhaps dead young, perhaps made invisible by the same world that had extinguished her mother, but perhaps, too, she lived a quiet life, with Catherine's eyes and Catherine's fire buried deep. Perhaps she taught herself to read from the pages her mother left behind. Perhaps she saw her mother's ghost in the chapel window and knew, even for a moment, what power once looked like. No one recorded it. No one remembered it. But Catherine Parr was not meant to be remembered the way kings are remembered, with coin and crown and myth. She was meant to be remembered in the bloodlines of thought, in the rituals of grief no one dares name, in the shape of a woman's mouth closing over an idea too dangerous to speak. Her final days were not an ending. They were a door, left ajar in the corridor of women who almost became something more than wives, who almost changed the world, and who paid for it in silence. Catherine Parr died with her eyes open, and some part of her never blinked. She is still there, beneath the stone no one bows before, beneath the chapel where birds sing without knowing who they sing above. No portrait captures the silence of her end. No hymn was written for her grief, yet her breath lingers not in cathedrals, but in rooms where women read quietly, where thoughts are swallowed before they can be spoken aloud. She does not haunt in anger, she haunts in absence. She is the pause before a woman answers, the weight in a girl's chest when she is told to lower her gaze. The ache in a body that knows obedience is sometimes more fatal than defiance. The queen who survived did not survive at all. She merely postponed her execution long enough to die in private, to bleed where no one was watching, to be forgotten without spectacle. Her death was not a drama, but a deletion. And still, she remains, not as ghost, not as saint, but as question. What is the price of being the last one standing? When all the others have fallen in fire, what remains of a woman when even her survival is used against her? Her voice has long since quieted, but the wound does not close. It breathes, slow and soundless, through the cracks in every throne built on the backs of women who dared to think. The story ends not with a scream, not with a blade, but with a cradle that never rocked again and a grave no one visited. Yet beneath that soil, something waits. Not revenge, not resurrection, only the truth, coiled like a serpent beneath a veil that even queens are buried nameless if they die without permission. And so she lies there still. Catherine Parr, the final wife, eyes open, lips parted, waiting for someone to remember what was taken.